Counter-terror police in UK are investigating a fire that broke out at Prime Minister Starmer's North London home. Police say they had launched an investigation into a fire that caused damage outside Starmer's former family home. But we've got more to do. And I'll be honest, 'cause I'm always happy to talk about the things we're getting right. But I'll be honest on this one. I don't think we are going fast enough. And I also know that even once we've rolled out those, they would later try to explain the night as if it had signaled its arrival. But the truth is more fragile than that. It began with the calm people in cities take for granted. London humming its usual midweek tune. The one made of footsteps crossing wet pavement, buses sighing to a stop and shop windows glowing against the chill. Nothing about that evening seemed prepared to rupture. Even the sky felt indifferent, hanging low and gray in the way it always does before winter settles in. No one could have guessed that a tiny, almost invisible moment would tilt the entire night off its axis. It started with a thread of smoke curling upward near King's Cross, so thin it could have passed for a trick of the street lamps. One man paused long enough to notice, lifted his phone, filmed without thinking much of it, and kept walking. That short casual recording, half a minute of nothing, became the spark that shot across feeds around the world. People watched it long before they understood what they were witnessing. Then sound cracked through the usual London hum, glass meeting concrete, a muffled thud that blossomed into a brief flare of orange. Someone, nobody saw who, had hurled a bottle, and when it burst, fire crawled outward like a creature waking with a snarl. Heads whipped around. More phones rose. Live streams flickered to life. The flames, as if responding to the attention, stretched and snapped and fed on the dry air. Within minutes, the world spoke in the blunt language of hashtags and short captions. London was burning. A police fan was the next to catch its sirens. Blinked uselessly from inside a growing cloud of smoke, flashing red and blue, like a heartbeat fading under ash. Officers backed away as the crowd surged, swept forward by a chant that seemed to erupt from every direction at once. Protect our children. The words came in waves crashing over the street, with an eerie precision, as if hundreds of strangers had suddenly found the same rhythm. Above it all, helicopters carved frantic circles through the sky. The city's usual palette of amber street lights drowned beneath the deeper glow of fire, painting familiar roads in the bleeding colors of anger and unrest. It felt theatrical, almost scripted, except no one was directing it. Behind the thick walls of number 10, the silence was so heavy it felt staged. Curtains drawn, lights low, aides moving like shadows in a building suddenly too small for the fear inside it. No speeches, no statements, just the soft hum of emergency screens casting their cold light on tense faces. When a security official finally murmured that they had lost control of London Bridge, no one dared challenge the words. They didn't describe a location, but a collapse in authority itself. And across the city, neighborhoods began to splinter. Shoreditch lit up in bursts. Camden crackled with heat. Brixton pulsed with The stomp of thousands moving almost as one. Riot police formed lines that looked steady from afar, but shook up close, their shields catching stray sparks. They pushed, fell back, tried again, and faltered. Through the smoke, a new chant began to beat through the crowds. Whose nation? A pause. Then the raw ours. Not a plea, not a question, a claim. Traditional broadcasters lagged behind, still trying to assemble coherent segments while the truth had already spilled raw and unfiltered onto countless live streams. One officer, visor cracked and voice rasping, confessed into someone's shaky phone, "We're no longer in control." The clip ended abruptly, the final words hanging in the digital dark. Shops pulled down metal shutters. Makeshift barricades rose from bins, planks, and whatever else frightened hands could grab. Drones drifted above the Capitol, capturing scenes that felt unreal, even to those living them. Parliament bathed in red light. Narrow alleys flickering with fire. The Thames reflecting a city tearing at its edges. By the time the crowds reached Parliament Square, the ground itself seemed to vibrate. Flares drew red streaks across the night and chants rolled against the stone buildings. Inside, ministers shouted over each other, voices cracking from panic, not conviction. Orders were given, revoked, rewritten, when an aide burst in to report that Trafalgar Square had fallen to protesters. The room froze. The Prime Minister's eyes drifted past the window, unfocused, and he whispered something that wasn't meant to be recorded. God help us all. The unrest seeped beyond London. Birmingham woke to the sound of shouts. Manchester filled with marching feet. Bristol led. Newcastle. The same pattern repeated as if the entire country shared one restless pulse. Outside migrant centers, tempers ignited. Police stations barricaded themselves. Helicopters drew restless loops above city centers. One video filmed on a quiet street captured a line of military veterans standing between clashing groups, saying nothing, simply holding their ground. "We served once," said an older man murmured. "We'll stand again if we must." The stillness of their lines struck millions. The government's next move was to choke the flow of information. The BC froze on static shots. News channels stalled. Certain hashtags quietly stopped refreshing, but silence only sharpened suspicion. People migrated to other platforms, found ways around blocks, shared footage in encrypted corners of the internet. The night refused to be hidden as power grids flickered. Parts of Westminster slipped into shadow, leaving silhouettes pacing behind frosted glass. The Prime Minister appeared on screen hours later, insisting all was stable. But the country had already seen enough chaos to disbelieve every word. The broadcast cut out halfway, not because anyone lost the signal, but because no one cared to continue watching. Then came the moment that would become the symbol of the night. In Parliament Square, amid drifting smoke and the fading echo of Sinans, a single police officer stepped forward. His movements were slow, deliberate. He placed his shield on the ground, its edge tapping softly against the stone, and walked away. No speech. No flare of rebellion, just a quiet refusal. Then another officer did the same and another. Soon, an entire row of shields lay abandoned in a neat line. Like relics from a battle already surrendered inside government corridors. Panic thickened, phones rang unanswered. Advisors argued. Ministers barked orders. None had the resources to carry them out. When armored military vehicles rolled through London streets, many believed the show of force would restore order. Instead, the crowd grew louder and angrier. The sight of soldiers stirred something deeper, and people who had never marched in their lives found themselves joining the swelling tide. In Brixton, a line of vehicles halted. Young soldiers stepped out, glancing around with uncertainty. Boys barely older than the ones chanting in front of them. For a long moment, they didn't move. They didn't raise weapons. They just stood there as unsure as everyone else about what role they were meant to play in a nation arguing with itself. But no one, neither officials nor citizens, could pretend the old order remained intact. The night had cracked. It opened and the dawn did nothing to hide the fracture. By mid-morning, the sun rose weakly through a haze of smoke, its light thinning as it fought to reach the streets below. London looked less like a capital and more like the aftermath of a long unplanned siege. Burned-out cars sat like skeletons along the curb. Posters clung to walls in torn strips. Ash drifted in slow spirals through the air, settling on rooftops, on benches, on the shoulders of those still wandering in shock. The city felt suspended, caught between the remnants of a riot and the beginning of something far more dangerous. Emergency broadcasts pinged across phones urging people to stay indoors, but few listened. Crowds wandered toward Westminster as if pulled by an invisible tide. Journalists who had spent the night scrambling for fragments of clarity now stood speechless, their microphones lowered, unsure what narrative to cling to as events continued unraveling faster than they could speak them aloud. Inside number 10, exhaustion hung thicker than the smoke outside. Ministers slumped in chairs, ties loosened, sleeves rolled. Reports from across the country hit the table in rapid disjointed bursts. Sheffield city centre gridlocked. Brighton's seafront overtaken by crowds chanting the same relentless slogans. Cardiff police requesting reinforcements they would not receive. Each update chipped away at what little resolve remained in the room. As somewhere down the corridor, someone slammed a door hard enough to echo. An advisor rushed in, clutching a tablet. "Prime Minister, you need to see this," he said, voice trembling. A live feed showed Leeds's market engulfed in what looked less like a fire and more like a rolling wave of rage. The camera shook as the person filming backed away. A tower of smoke rose into the sky, thick and black, dwarfing the city skyline. "What triggered that?" a minister whispered. "No one knows," the advisor replied. "It could be anything now. A rumor, a message, a misunderstanding." The Prime Minister pressed his hands against his temples. Every new eruption felt more senseless than the last, yet Somehow inevitable, like aftershocks following a quake. By early afternoon, the protests had splintered into distinct factions. Some carried signs demanding justice. Others marched in fury against the government. A smaller but growing number, their faces covered, seemed determined only to tear down whatever they found standing between. These groups, civilians moved with the dazed expressions of people trying to decide whether to join, flee, or hide. At the edges of Hyde Park, an older woman stood beside a toppled statue, tears streaking her soot-covered cheeks. A reporter approached gently, but she waved him away, staring silently at the broken stone. "He survived the war," she finally whispered. "But not this." Meanwhile, in a quiet alley near Victoria Station, a different kind of scene unfolded. A young officer, barely 20, sat with his back against a brick wall, helmet off, hands shaking. Across from him sat a teenage boy, maybe 17. Hands scraped and eyes red from smoke. They weren't fighting. They weren't shouting. They were simply breathing in the same stunned silence. The camera that recorded them caught a single fragile truth. Both of them were scared. Both too young to carry the weight placed on their shoulders overnight. As images like these began to circulate, they struck something raw in the public. Fury still burned, but exhaustion crept in around the edges. People who had stormed into the streets with blazing certainty now hesitated, wondering what line they'd crossed without realizing it. But the pause came too late. At 4:17 p.m., an explosion thundered through the South Bank. Windows shattered. Flocks of birds erupted into the sky. For 30 full seconds, no one understood what had happened. Then the smoke lifted enough to reveal the scorched shell of a cultural center, its glass roof collapsed inward, debris scattering across the Thames edge. Speculation erupted instantly. Terror attack. Sabotage, a gas line accident. No one had answers, and in a day already collapsing under its own weight. Not knowing became the most dangerous spark of all. Crowds surged again. Panic rippled in waves. Parliament went into full lockdown. Rumors spread faster than verified facts, each one more alarming than the last. And somewhere inside the chaos, a truth quietly rooted itself in the minds of millions. This was no longer unrest. This was a turning point. And the country no longer knew which direction it was turning toward. Sirens wailed across the river, but even they sounded strained, as if pushed beyond their capacity after a night and day of ceaseless crisis. The explosion had not merely rattled the South Bank. It had broken whatever thin barrier still separated fear from full-scale national panic. People fled in every direction, their movements frantic and disordered. Like a city suddenly learning it no longer had a center to hold on to. Inside the emergency command hub beneath Whitehall, officials spoke in clipped, breathless fragments. Every screen flickered with a different disaster. Fires rekindling in Camden. Crowds pressing against barricades in Bristol. Ambulances immobilized behind mobs in Manchester. A single red dot blinked in the top corner of the main display. The South Bank blast site. It's flashing. Pulse, a reminder that something far worse might still be unfolding, and no one had the capacity left to assess it properly. We need a statement, one advisor said, voice cracking, not a speech. A stance, something the public can anchor to. A stance, another snapped. On what? Which version of events? The truth, the rumors, the lies we haven't even identified yet. Silence swallowed the room for a long, brittle moment. Then a junior staffer, barely noticed, pale with exhaustion, murmured, "They don't want clarity. They want certainty. Even if it's fragile, even if it's temporary." But certainty was the one resource the government no longer possessed. Beyond Westminster, something else was beginning to stir. Beneath the layers of smoke and shouting, beneath the noise of marching crowds and the low drone of helicopters, a quieter energy took root. Not hope, not yet, but something colder, sharper, more dangerous. At first, it surfaced as patterns. Crowds moving with unspoken coordination. Flanks forming and dispersing in ways that didn't feel accidental. Then came messages circulating through encrypted channels. Meeting points, supply routes, coordinated routes around police plans that no single person could have created alone, but millions could follow without question. And above all, a symbol, a black circle with a single fracture running through it, spreading online faster than any official statement. It wasn't tied to a political party. It wasn't linked to a known group. It was simply there, waiting, appearing on banners, hoodies, digital icons, a logo for a movement no one had formally named. By evening, that symbol was projected onto the side of an office tower in Canary Wharf. A silent, ominous declaration that the unrest had found its identity before the government could reclaim its authority. In Nottingham, a police outpost was abandoned without a fight. In Glasgow, a peaceful march of nearly 10,000 advanced through the city centre with an eerie synchronicity. No chanting, no signs, just the quiet press of bodies moving with one purpose no one could articulate aloud. In Cardiff, a barricade built overnight stretched across 3 streets, manned by volunteers who refused to explain which side they belonged to. "We're protecting our own," a woman told a reporter. "Whichever side that is." Night fell again, but it did not feel like the same night that had shattered London. This darkness felt older, as if the country was now stepping into the second act of something far bigger than riots and chants and burning vehicles. In the shadow of Parliament, the crowds had swelled into the tens of thousands. Torches, not phones, not flares. Torches glowed through the haze. The river hissed with reflected fire. Above the square, drones hovered in a slow, looping formation. And then the sound began. Not a chant, not a scream, a low, steady hum. Hundreds of voices, then thousands. Not words, just a building resonance that vibrated through the ground, through stone, through bone. A sound that felt less like a protest and more like an omen. Inside Parliament, the Prime Minister stood at the window, shoulders rounded, face drawn. He Watched the torches, the gathering mass. The symbol projected on distant buildings and said nothing. But someone behind him whispered the only truth. Left. This isn't a riot anymore. It's a reckoning. And outside, as the hum grew louder, deeper, unified, relentless, the crowd finally began to move as one body. Toward the gates of Parliament, the night was no longer waiting for the government. It was coming for it. The march toward Parliament didn't happen with the chaotic surge of a riot. It unfolded with the slow, deliberate certainty of a tide advancing across a shore. Torches flickered in thousands of hands, their flames wavering in the cold air, casting long, stretching shadows across the square. Beneath the unified hum rising from the crowd, you could feel something ancient, an instinct older than government, older than order, stirring awake. At the front, a narrow path opened as if the crowd itself understood where the next moment needed to happen. Figures stepped through, not masked, not armed, but marked. Each wore the black circle with a single fracture. The symbol that had spread faster than any official narrative. No leader emerged. No face claimed authority. They simply walked with the confidence of people who knew the crowd would follow. At the perimeter gates, the line of police was smaller than it should have been. Many had left their posts hours earlier, called back, reassigned, or silently choosing not to stand against a force they no longer recognized. Those who remained held shields that trembled ever so slightly in their hands. They weren't afraid of violence. They had seen violence already. They were afraid of the silence, the hum, the way the crowd moved like a single organism. A young constable whispered to the officer beside him. Why aren't they shouting? The older officer answered without looking away. Because they don't need to. In the command bunker beneath Westminster, alarms began to pulse across the screens as sensors detected the massing of bodies against the gates. Advisors circled like trapped birds, voices rising in frantic crescendos. Military officials argued over how much force could be deployed without igniting something catastrophic. They're not attacking, one general insisted. They're approaching. That's a crucial difference. They won't stay passive. Another snap back. This is coordinated. This is controlled, and if we wait too long, we lose the last leverage we have. But leverage was already slipping. On the ground, the front row of protesters stopped a meter from the police line. No one spoke. No one stepped forward. They simply stood so close that the heat from their torches brushed the officers' shields. The hum ended suddenly, replaced by a silence that pressed against the eardrums like altitude. Then a single figure emerged from the crowd. A woman 40, maybe 50, her hair streak silver, her coat frayed at the edges. Nothing about her suggested authority. Yet the entire square seemed to lean toward her. She lifted her torch, held it out, not toward the police, but toward the sky, as if offering it to something unseen. The police braced, but she simply said in a voice steady enough to cut through the quiet, "Stand down." She wasn't speaking to the officers. That she was speaking to the crowd and to the horror of the government watching from their screens. The crowd Obeyed. Thousands lowered their torches. In one coordinated motion. Thousands backed a single step away from the gates. The movement was too precise, too unified to be spontaneous. Inside Parliament, confusion erupted. "They're retreating," a minister shouted, disbelief twisting the words. "No." Another answered quietly, watching the screens where with a growing dread. "They're positioning." The crowd was making space. Space for what? The answer arrived moments later. From the far end of Parliament Square, the drums began. Slow, deep, steady. Boom. Boom. Ben.